At just 27 years old and homeless, Emily believed she had reached the end of her story. With nowhere left to go on a freezing winter night, she stepped into a forgotten stone house that shouldn't have been waiting for anyone. What she found inside wasn't money or a miracle. It was something so unexpected that it completely changed the course of her life and would eventually change the lives of hundreds of strangers. Stay with me until the end, because the final moments reveal why this forgotten house became the place where hopeless people found a reason to live again. There are some wounds that time doesn't heal. They simply become quieter. By the time Emily Dawson was 27, loneliness had become so familiar that it felt less like an emotion and more like the air she breathed. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her and said her name with warmth. Not because people were cruel, but because no one stayed long enough. Her parents were killed in a highway accident when she was 6 years old. After that came a childhood measured not in birthdays, but in cardboard boxes, temporary bedrooms, and the awkward silence of strangers saying, "You'll be moving again next week." For years, Emily tried to believe none of it was her fault. Eventually, she stopped trying. Deep inside, she began to believe something far more painful. People didn't leave because life was unfair. People left because she was never worth staying for. As an adult, she worked harder than anyone around her. She waited tables until her feet ached, cleaned motel rooms where families laughed behind doors that were never hers, and stocked grocery shelves through the night before curling up in an old sedan she quietly called home. Every evening she made clean beds for strangers. Every night she wondered where she would sleep. The little money she managed to save disappeared after a dishonest landlord vanished with months of rent. Weeks later, the diner where she worked closed without warning. Then came the overdue bills, the empty bank account, and one impossible choice after another. By the time winter arrived, Emily owned little more than a faded photograph of her parents and the silver necklace her mother had fastened around her neck the morning they took their last trip together. Sometimes she would hold that necklace and close her eyes, trying to remember her mother's voice. What frightened her most wasn't that she couldn't. It was realizing she had almost stopped missing it. Then came the coldest night anyone in town could remember. The emergency shelter was full. The volunteer at the front door apologized with tears in her eyes, but an apology couldn't stop the snow from falling. Emily thanked her anyway. She always thanked people, even when life gave her nothing in return. Hours later, with snow collecting on her shoulders and feeling slowly disappearing from her hands, she wandered onto a forgotten road that disappeared into the woods. She wasn't searching for a miracle anymore. She was only searching for one more hour. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw a single golden light glowing from the porch of an old stone house. Years later, Emily would often tell people that the miracle wasn't finding that house. The miracle was discovering that someone had left the light on. For a girl who had spent her entire life believing no one was waiting for her, Emily stood frozen at the bottom of the weathered stone steps, staring at the small porch light that glowed through the curtain of falling snow. It didn't make sense. The house looked as though it had been forgotten years ago. Thick ivy clung to the stone walls, and the wooden shutters had faded beneath countless winters. Yet the porch had been swept clean. No snow rested on the steps. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted lazily from the chimney into the dark sky. Someone had to be inside. She climbed the steps slowly, her legs trembling more from exhaustion than fear. For a long moment, she simply stood there, listening. Nothing. No voices. No television. No footsteps. Only the wind whispering through the pine trees. Emily knocked once. The sound echoed into the silence. She waited. No answer. I'm sorry to bother you," she called softly, almost embarrassed by the sound of her own voice. "I just need somewhere warm for a little while." Still nothing. She should have walked away. Any sensible person probably would have, but the cold had already numbed her fingers, and every breath burned inside her chest. Carefully, she reached for the old brass doorknob. To her surprise, the door wasn't locked. It opened with a gentle creak. Warm air wrapped around her face like a blanket. Emily closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever. She wasn't cold. Inside, the house smelled of cedarwood, cinnamon, and something quietly familiar she couldn't quite name. It reminded her of childhood somehow, not of a specific memory, but of the feeling that somewhere, long ago, someone had once cared whether she was warm. She hesitated at the doorway. "I don't want to intrude," she whispered into the empty house. "If someone lives here, I'll leave as soon as the storm passes." Only silence answered. The living room was simple but beautiful. A fire crackled softly in a stone fireplace. An old rocking chair sat beside it, with a half-finished knitting project resting neatly on one arm. A lamp glowed in the corner. A teacup sat on the table. Not dusty, not abandoned, as though someone had stepped away only moments before. Emily's heartbeat quickened. "Hello." Nothing. She walked farther inside. Near the fireplace, she noticed something that made her stop. A thick wool blanket had been folded carefully across a small sofa. Beside it sat a steaming bowl of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and a handwritten note. With trembling hands, Emily picked it up. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting was graceful and steady. It read only 7 words. "If you're tired, you're home now." Emily stared at the sentence for what felt like an eternity. No one had ever written words like that for her. Not once. Her vision blurred. She told herself it was because she'd come in from the cold. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She lowered herself onto the sofa almost cautiously, as though afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. The soup was still warm. Not hot, just warm enough to comfort someone whose body had nearly surrendered to the winter. She whispered, "Thank you," even though no one seemed to be there to hear it. After eating, exhaustion overtook her. She intended only to rest for a few minutes. Instead, she fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in years. When she opened her eyes the next morning, sunlight poured gently through the lace curtains. For a brief, beautiful moment, she forgot everything. Then reality returned. The accident, the foster homes, the diner, the eviction, the snowstorm. She sat upright, suddenly embarrassed. Had she slept in a stranger's house all night? "Hello," she called again. Still no answer. She folded the blanket carefully, washed the bowl, placed the note exactly where she'd found it. She wanted whoever lived there to know that she wasn't the kind of person who took kindness for granted. Before leaving, she searched every room, hoping to thank the owner. The house was spotless. Every bed had been made. Fresh flowers stood in glass jars on the windowsills despite the middle of winter. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, yet there wasn't a single photograph of anyone living there. Not one. It was as though the house remembered people, but refused to tell their names. Just as Emily reached for the front door, something caught her eye. A narrow draft slipped through the stones behind the fireplace. Curious, she knelt down. One of the stones looked slightly different from the others. She pressed against it. With a soft click, part of the wall shifted open just enough to reveal a hidden wooden door. Emily's breath caught. For several seconds she simply stared, unsure whether to step closer or walk away. Common sense told her this wasn't her home. She had no right to open another person's secrets. But another voice, one she hadn't listened to in years, quietly whispered that perhaps she hadn't found this place by accident. Slowly, she turned the old iron handle. The door opened into a small room no bigger than a closet. Shelves lined every wall. On them sat dozens of cassette tapes, each carefully labeled in the same elegant handwriting she had seen on the note. There were no dates, no names, only the same sentence repeated over and over. For the one who believes she has been forgotten, Emily reached toward the nearest tape but stopped just short of touching it. A strange feeling settled over her. Not fear. Not exactly. It was something she couldn't explain. As though the room had been waiting, not for just anyone, but for someone carrying a loneliness that looked exactly like her own. With trembling fingers, she picked up the first cassette. Beside it rested an old tape recorder, polished, clean, and already loaded with fresh batteries. Someone had expected this moment. Someone had believed that one day, a stranger would walk through that front door, survive the storm, discover this hidden room, and press play for several long seconds. Emily simply stared at the cassette resting in her hands. It was ordinary. The clear plastic case had yellowed with age, and the handwritten label had begun to fade around the edges. Yet somehow, it felt more valuable than anything she had ever owned. For the one who believes she has been forgotten, those words echoed through her mind. They weren't just written on the tape. They described her, almost perfectly. She glanced toward the tape recorder sitting quietly beside it. Someone had placed fresh batteries inside. Someone had expected this machine to work. Her heart began to race. She almost put everything back where she had found it. Maybe she shouldn't listen. Maybe these recordings belonged to someone's family. Maybe opening them would be crossing a line she had no right to cross. Then another thought quietly surfaced. If someone had wanted these voices to remain hidden, why leave the batteries? Emily drew a slow breath and pressed the play button. For a moment, only static filled the tiny room. Then came the sound of an older woman clearing her throat. Her voice was soft, warm, the kind of voice that never needed to be loud to be heard. Well, a gentle laugh followed. If this tape is playing, then I suppose you've finally made it. Emily froze. The woman continued. My name is Margaret. I don't know your name. I don't know how old you are. I don't know where you've come from. But I do know one thing. You almost didn't believe you'd survive long enough to find this place. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. How could anyone possibly know that? She had told no one. Not the shelter volunteer. Not the cashier who had wished her luck the day before. No one. Margaret's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as though she were sitting beside the fire, speaking directly to one old friend. If you're anything like the people who came before you, you've become very good at pretending you were fine. You probably apologize too much. You thank people for the smallest kindness. You've learned not to ask for help because disappointment hurts less when you expect nothing. Emily slowly lowered herself onto the wooden floor. Every sentence felt uncomfortably familiar. She had apologized for knocking on the front door. She had thanked an empty room for a bowl of soup. She hadn't asked anyone for help in years. Tears gathered in her eyes before she realized she was crying. Margaret paused for several seconds. I've often wondered what your story might be. Perhaps someone left. Perhaps someone died. Perhaps the world simply became too heavy. But whatever brought you here, I hope you know this. You are not here because you failed. You're here because you kept going. Emily covered her mouth to stop herself from sobbing aloud. No one had ever looked at her life that way. People had pitied her, ignored her, judged her, but no one had ever called her survival a kind of courage. Margaret's voice softened even further. Look around this little room. Every tape you see was made for someone I've never met. Not because I knew who they would be, but because I knew loneliness always finds someone. Outside, the wind rattled gently against the old windows. Inside, only Margaret's voice filled the silence. There was a time when this house belonged only to me. I thought that was enough. I was wrong. Another long pause. Then came words that seemed to carry years of regret. My husband and I once dreamed of filling these rooms with children. We waited. We prayed. We hoped. But that blessing never came. Emily listened without moving. I spent many years asking God why He had left this house so empty. It took me far too long to understand. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. Emily wiped her tears. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness, not relief. Hope, small enough to fit inside her hand. Fragile enough to disappear with one careless thought. But real. Margaret continued. The first person who ever knocked on this door was a teenage boy. He had nowhere to sleep. He stayed one night. When he left the next morning, he smiled. It was the first smile I'd seen inside this house, and somehow it made the rooms feel alive. Emily smiled through her tears without realizing it. Margaret laughed softly. After that came a young mother, then an old veteran, a widow, a college student, a man who had lost everything. They all believed they were arriving by accident. They weren't. The tape crackled briefly. Then Margaret spoke more quietly than before. If you're listening carefully, you've probably started wondering who owns this house now. Emily glanced toward the doorway. She had wondered exactly that. I won't answer that today. Some truths arrive too early. They become burdens instead of blessings. Emily frowned slightly. What did that mean? Margaret seemed almost amused. Be patient. The house has survived many winters. It can wait a little longer. Emily reached toward the recorder, tempted to rewind everything she had just heard. Instead, another sound interrupted her. A car door slammed outside. She stiffened. Moments later, gravel crunched beneath slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking toward the front porch. Not hurried, not uncertain. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where they were going. Emily's heart pounded. She quickly switched off the recorder and held her breath. 3 quiet knocks echoed through the house. Not loud, not threatening, almost familiar. Then an older man's voice called gently through the front door. Margaret. He paused, as though already knowing no one would answer. Then he spoke one sentence that sent a chill through Emily despite the warmth of the fire. I suppose someone finally found the light. Emily remained perfectly still. The old cassette recorder sat silent beside her, but Margaret's words continued echoing inside her mind. You're here because you kept going. No one had ever described her life that way before. For years, she'd believed she had simply been surviving from one bad day to the next. Now, for the first time, she wondered if survival required more courage than she'd ever allowed herself to believe. Another knock came from the front door. Gentle, patient. Not the impatient pounding of someone demanding to be let in. Emily carefully slipped the cassette back into its case and placed it exactly where she'd found it. After taking one last look around the hidden room, she quietly closed the wooden door behind her. The secret disappeared into the stone wall as though it had never existed. She walked slowly toward the front entrance. When she opened the door, an elderly man stood on the porch with snow resting lightly across the shoulders of his dark wool coat. He looked to be somewhere in his 70s. His silver hair peeked out beneath an old flat cap, and deep lines framed kind but weary blue eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The man wasn't surprised to see her. If anything, he looked relieved. "You must be freezing," he said gently. Emily instinctively stepped backward. "I'm sorry," she answered quickly. "I didn't mean to trespass the storm. I just needed somewhere to stay. I'll leave right away." The old man studied her face for a moment before offering the faintest smile. "That's exactly what every person who ever stayed here has said." Emily frowned. "You know about this place?" He nodded. "I've known this house for over 40 years. She hesitated before asking the question that had been growing heavier in her heart. "Where is Margaret?" The smile slowly disappeared from the man's face. He lowered his eyes toward the snow-covered porch. "Margaret passed away almost 8 years ago." Emily felt the words hit her harder than she expected. She looked back into the warm living room behind her. The fire, the soup, the blanket, the flowers. Everything had felt so alive. So. Her voice barely escaped above a whisper. "No one lives here." The man looked past her into the house. "Oh," he said quietly. "I wouldn't say that." Emily wasn't sure what he meant. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed. Then, instead of walking inside, he remained standing on the porch, almost as though he believed the house deserved permission before anyone entered. "I came every month," he explained. "I cleaned the chimney, fixed whatever winter had broken, replaced food, watered the plants, changed the batteries in the tape recorder." Emily stared at him. "You knew someone would come." Thomas smiled sadly. "I didn't know who, but Margaret did." Emily's heart skipped. "She knew me." Thomas slowly shook his head. "No. She believed someone like you would come." He looked toward the woods stretching beyond the house. "Loneliness never disappears. It simply changes names." Those words lingered between them. Thomas finally stepped inside and gently closed the door behind him. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them both. He stood silently before Margaret's rocking chair for several moments. "I still expect to see her sitting here." His voice cracked slightly. "Old habits don't leave us easily." Emily noticed his eyes resting on the unfinished knitting. "It hasn't moved." Thomas smiled. "I could never bring myself to touch it." After another long silence, he spoke again. "Margaret used to tell me something. People think hunger is the hardest thing to survive." He looked at Emily. "It isn't. The hardest thing is believing nobody would notice if you disappeared tomorrow." Emily lowered her eyes. She had never admitted those thoughts aloud. But there had been nights inside her car when she truly believed the world would continue exactly the same if she simply stopped existing, without realizing it. Tears filled her eyes again. Thomas didn't pretend not to notice. He simply waited. After a while, Emily quietly asked, "Who was she?" Thomas walked slowly toward the fireplace. "Most people thought Margaret was simply an elderly widow. They never knew the whole story." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a faded black and white photograph. Margaret stood in front of the very same house. Around her were dozens of smiling faces. Children, young adults, older men and women. Some held babies. Some leaned on canes. All of them were laughing. Emily looked closer. "There are so many people." Thomas nodded. "Every one of them knocked on this door believing they had nowhere else to go." He paused. and every one of them eventually left believing they did. Emily carefully traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. What happened to them? They built lives. They found families. They forgave themselves. They forgave people they never thought they could. He smiled softly. Some became teachers. Some became nurses. One started a shelter. Another adopted 3 children. Emily stared at him. Margaret hadn't simply saved people. She had changed the direction of entire lives. Thomas noticed the realization forming in Emily's eyes. Do you know what surprised Margaret the most? Emily shook her head. Almost everyone came here believing they needed food. He smiled. They left realizing what they had really been starving for. Emily whispered, "What was that?" Thomas looked around the quiet room. A place where they didn't have to earn being loved. The sentence settled into the silence like a prayer. Emily thought back over her own life. Every foster home. Every job. Every relationship that never lasted. She had spent years trying to deserve a place in someone's life. Trying to work harder. Smile more. Need less. Apologize sooner. Leave before anyone else could leave her. She had believed love was something people received only after proving they were useful. Margaret had believed exactly the opposite. For the first time in years, Emily felt something inside her begin to loosen. Not the pain. That was still there. Not the grief. That would probably always remain. It was something deeper. The belief she'd carried since childhood. People leave because I'm not enough. It suddenly felt less certain. As afternoon light spilled through the old windows, Emily found herself looking around the house differently. Yesterday, she had seen a safe place to survive one cold night. Today, she saw something far greater. This wasn't simply an old stone house hidden in the woods. It was proof that one ordinary person could spend an entire lifetime quietly changing the world. One lonely soul at a time, and without fully understanding why. Emily realized she wasn't thinking about where she would go next. For the first time in longer than she could remember. She was wondering if perhaps she had already arrived. Emily had planned to stay only one more day. That was all. Just long enough for the roads to clear and the buses to start running again. She told herself she couldn't become attached to a place that wasn't hers. After all, every place she'd ever called home had eventually belonged to someone else. She had learned not to unpack, not to settle in, not to believe. Yet when she mentioned leaving over breakfast the following morning, Thomas looked up from his cup of coffee and asked a question she wasn't expecting. "Where will you go?" Emily opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She realized she didn't have an answer. Thomas didn't press her. He simply nodded, as though silence itself had answered the question. "I thought so." Outside, the snow had begun to melt. Thin streams of water trickled down the stone path, and for the first time since arriving, Emily could hear birds singing somewhere beyond the trees. The storm had passed, but inside her, something else was just beginning. Over the next few days, Thomas returned every morning. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes firewood, sometimes he brought nothing at all. They worked quietly together. Emily swept the porch. Thomas repaired a loose fence. Neither of them spoke very much. Somehow, they didn't need to. Each afternoon, after Thomas left, Emily found herself returning to the hidden room behind the fireplace. One cassette became 2. 2 became 5. Then 10. Margaret never rushed her stories. She spoke as though she understood that healing couldn't be hurried. One afternoon, she said something Emily wrote down in an old notebook. Broken hearts don't need perfect answers. They need safe places to rest. Emily read those words again and again. For years, she had believed people healed because someone fixed their problems. Margaret believed something entirely different. People healed because someone stayed. Nearly 2 weeks after the storm, there was another knock at the front door. Emily smiled to herself. "Morning, Thomas." She opened the door. It wasn't Thomas. Standing on the porch was a young woman, no older than 22. Her clothes were soaked from the rain. She clutched a backpack tightly against her chest. Dark circles surrounded frightened eyes that hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," the young woman whispered. "I saw the light." Emily's heart stopped for a moment. Those were almost the exact words she herself could have spoken 2 weeks earlier. Without thinking, she stepped aside. "Come in." The young woman hesitated. "I don't have any money." Emily smiled gently. "You don't need any." The woman stood frozen, almost suspicious. Emily recognized that look immediately. It was the expression of someone who had learned that kindness usually came with conditions. "I'll leave in the morning," the woman said quickly. Emily remembered saying those exact words herself. "You can stay as long as you need." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, embarrassed. Emily quietly handed her a towel. No questions. No judgment. Just warmth. Much later that evening, after the young woman had fallen asleep beside the fireplace, Emily sat alone with another one of Margaret's tapes, almost as if she had known this day would come. Margaret's familiar voice drifted from the recorder. "One day, someone will knock on this door while you're standing on the other side." Emily slowly looked toward the sleeping stranger. Margaret continued, "When that happens, don't ask whether they deserve your kindness. Ask yourself how frightened you once felt." Emily felt tears sliding silently down her cheeks. It was as though Margaret had reached across time and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The following morning, Thomas arrived carrying fresh bread. He stopped when he noticed another pair of muddy boots drying beside the fireplace. He smiled. "So," he said softly, "it begins." Emily looked at him. "What begins?" Thomas set the bread on the kitchen table. "The house." Emily frowned. "I don't understand." Thomas walked slowly toward the window. "For years after Margaret died, I kept the fire burning because I thought I was preserving her memory." He looked back at Emily. "I was wrong. The house was never meant to preserve memories. It was meant to create them." Emily stood quietly. Thomas's next words settled deep inside her heart. "You know, I've been waiting 8 years to hear laughter in this house again." Emily glanced toward the living room. The young woman had just woken up. She was smiling shyly while petting an old orange cat that had somehow wandered onto the porch. The sound of that small laugh floated through the house. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment. There it is. Emily had never imagined that something as simple as another person's laughter could make a house feel alive. Now, she understood exactly what Margaret had meant. Days turned into weeks. Word seemed to spread without anyone knowing how. A widower whose furnace had failed during another cold night. A middle-aged woman escaping an abusive relationship. A truck driver stranded during a snowstorm. A grandmother traveling with her young grandson after losing her apartment. None of them stayed forever. Most remained only a few nights. Some stayed longer. Every one of them arrived carrying the same invisible burden. The fear that they had become too broken, too unwanted, too forgotten. Emily never asked for explanations. She simply placed another bowl on the table, another blanket by the fire, another chair beside the hearth. Sometimes people talked. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they sat in complete silence for hours. Margaret had been right. Not every wound needed advice. Some wounds simply needed someone willing to stay in the room. Late one evening, after everyone had gone to sleep, Emily stood on the porch beneath a sky filled with stars. The porch light cast its familiar golden glow across the old stone steps. She remembered the frightened woman who had stumbled through the snow believing she was completely alone. It felt like remembering someone else. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Emily wasn't wondering who might leave her next. She was wondering whose life might be changed. By finding that light still burning, there was something different about the old stone house now. Not because the walls had changed, not because the furniture had been moved. The difference was laughter. For years, the house had stood quietly among the pine trees, keeping its light burning for people who had nowhere else to go. Now that light had faces, names, stories. Every morning, Emily woke before sunrise. She would quietly add another log to the fire before anyone else stirred. The kettle was always the first thing she put on. Margaret had once said on one of the tapes, "People rarely remember the meal. They remember how it felt to be welcomed." Emily never forgot those words. When the first guests wandered sleepily into the kitchen, they never found questions waiting for them. Only warm coffee, fresh bread, and someone smiling as if they had been expected all along. It was remarkable how quickly people began to change. Not overnight. Healing never worked that way. But little by little, the young woman who had arrived soaked by the rain eventually stopped flinching every time someone entered the room. The widower whose furnace had failed began humming old country songs while helping Thomas repair the porch. The grandmother who had nearly lost hope baked apple pies every Sunday, insisting that no house should ever smell only of firewood. Even the truck driver, who had spoken fewer than 20 words during his first 3 days, slowly began telling stories that made everyone laugh until tears rolled down their cheeks. Emily often watched these moments from across the room. She noticed something Margaret had understood long before she ever did. People didn't heal because someone erased their pain. They healed because, for the first time in a very long while, they no longer carried it alone. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf in the living room, Emily discovered a leather journal tucked behind several worn novels. Its cover was cracked with age. Inside were hundreds of names, each followed by only one sentence. Started nursing school, reunited with his daughter, celebrated 5 years sober, opened a bakery, found peace, no addresses, no photographs, just small glimpses into lives that had continued long after leaving the house. Emily turned page after page. There were so many names, far more than she had imagined. Some entries stretched back over 40 years. At the very end of the journal, Margaret had written a single paragraph. "People often thanked me for changing their lives. The truth is, they changed mine. Every person who walked through this door reminded me that hope is never wasted on another human being." Emily closed the journal slowly. She rested both hands on its worn cover. For years, she had believed she had nothing valuable to give anyone. Now she was holding proof that simply opening a door had altered generations of lives. She whispered to herself, "Maybe kindness travels farther than we ever get to see." As spring settled over the valley, the garden surrounding the old house began to bloom. Emily spent hours pulling weeds beside Thomas. The work was slow, peaceful. One afternoon, Thomas handed her a small packet of flower seeds, Margaret's favorite wildflowers. "They come back every year," he said, "even after the hardest winters." Emily smiled. "They're stubborn." Thomas chuckled softly. "No, they just know winter isn't the end of the story." Emily looked down at the tiny seeds resting in her palm. For the first time, she realized he wasn't talking about flowers. Weeks later, another cassette caught her attention. Unlike the others, it carried no title, only a small handwritten note. For the caretaker, Emily hesitated before pressing play. Margaret's familiar voice filled the room. "If you've reached this recording, and then the house has already chosen you." Emily's breath caught. "Chosen," Margaret continued. "You'll spend a long time wondering whether you're worthy. Please don't. I wondered the same thing. You are not here because you're extraordinary. You're here because you remember what it felt like to stand outside in the cold." Emily felt tears gathering again. Margaret paused before speaking more softly. "The world has enough people who know how to fix things. It desperately needs more people who know how to sit beside someone while they're breaking." Emily leaned back in the old chair. She thought about every version of herself she had been. The frightened little girl clutching a backpack. The teenager who stopped unpacking because she knew she'd soon be leaving again. The young woman who thanked strangers for scraps of kindness because she expected nothing more. For years, she had carried one quiet belief everywhere she went: no one stays. But now, every evening she looked around the dinner table and saw people choosing to stay one more conversation, one more cup of tea, one more sunrise. Perhaps she had been wrong all along. Perhaps love wasn't measured by how many people stayed forever. Perhaps it was measured by whether someone made you feel less alone while they were there. That thought changed something inside her. Summer arrived. The old stone house no longer felt forgotten. Neighbors from nearby farms occasionally stopped by with baskets of vegetables. A retired carpenter repaired broken windows without accepting a penny. Children who had once stayed there with their parents returned carrying homemade cookies. Some came only to say thank you. Others came because they missed the place that had given them the courage to begin again. One afternoon, Emily noticed something that made her stop in the middle of sweeping the porch. A little boy, no older than 8, had carefully placed a small wooden sign beside the front steps. He had painted the letters himself. The words were uneven. The paint had dripped in places. But Emily had never seen anything more beautiful. The sign simply read, "Welcome home." She stood there for a long time, staring at those 2 words. Years ago, they would have sounded impossible. Now, they sounded true. Thomas walked onto the porch carrying a box of firewood. He noticed Emily wiping tears from her face. Without asking why, he looked at the little sign and smiled. "You know," he said quietly, "Margaret used to tell me something." Emily looked at him. Thomas's eyes remained fixed on the handmade sign. She believed that every person spends their life searching for home. He paused. The lucky ones eventually discover a home was never a place. It was the feeling of being welcomed without having to earn it. Emily looked toward the open front door. Inside, she could hear laughter drifting from the kitchen. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Someone was playing an old record. Someone else was singing off-key. Months earlier, she had arrived believing she was the forgotten one. Now she understood something Margaret had known for decades. Sometimes the deepest healing doesn't happen when someone rescues you. It happens the moment you discover that your greatest purpose is becoming the safe place you once spent your whole life searching for. By the time autumn returned, the old stone house no longer looked forgotten. Wildflowers framed the front porch. Fresh paint brightened the weathered shutters. The roof no longer leaked when it rained. The old fence stood straight again. But the greatest transformation wasn't something visitors could see. It was something they could hear. Laughter drifted through the kitchen. Children chased one another across the wooden floors. Conversations lingered around the fireplace long after dinner, where strangers slowly became friends, and burdens became lighter simply because someone else was willing to listen. The house had come back to life, and so had Emily. She no longer slept with her shoes beside the bed, ready to leave at a moment's notice. She no longer kept all her belongings packed inside a single backpack. For the first time since she was a little girl, she allowed herself to unpack. Her clothes filled a small closet upstairs. Her mother's necklace rested safely inside a carved wooden box beside her bed. The faded photograph she had carried for years now stood in a simple frame above the fireplace. Looking at it still brought tears to her eyes. But the tears had changed. The picture was no longer a reminder of everything she had lost. It had become a reminder that, even if only for a short while, she had once been deeply loved. One crisp October morning, Emily found Thomas sitting alone on the porch. A wool blanket covered his legs. A cup of coffee rested untouched beside him. He seemed unusually quiet, older than she remembered. She sat beside him without saying a word. Together, they watched golden leaves drift gently from the maple trees. After a long silence, Thomas smiled. Margaret loved autumn. Emily nodded. She talked about it on one of her tapes. Thomas chuckled softly. She always said trees were the bravest creatures God ever made. Emily looked at him. What? They let go of everything they've spent all year growing. He watched another leaf spiral toward the ground. And somehow, they trust spring will come back. Emily followed his gaze. The words sounded beautiful, but something in his voice made them feel heavier than before. She noticed the slight tremble in his hands, the slower rhythm of his breathing. A quiet fear settled inside her. Thomas. He smiled gently before she could finish. The doctor says my heart isn't as strong as it used to be. Emily felt her own heartbeat stumble. He continued calmly. I've probably got months. He shrugged. Maybe less. The world seemed to grow strangely quiet. Emily lowered her eyes. An old instinct returned. Don't become attached. Don't hope too much. Don't let yourself need someone, because everyone leaves eventually. For years, that belief had protected her. Or, at least she thought it had. But now, the thought of losing Thomas hurt more than she knew how to bear. Tears filled her eyes. No. The word escaped almost like a child's plea. Thomas turned toward her. You can't leave. She hated how frightened she sounded. He reached over and gently covered her hand with his own. Emily. Everyone leaves someday. She closed her eyes. Those words had haunted her since childhood. But Thomas wasn't finished. What matters, he said softly, is whether we leave love behind. Something inside Emily broke open. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. For the first time in her life, she didn't apologize for crying. She didn't try to hide her grief. Thomas simply held her the way a father might comfort his daughter. Neither of them searched for comforting words. Some moments couldn't be fixed. They could only be shared. That evening, Thomas asked Emily to bring him Margaret's leather journal. He slowly turned the worn pages until he reached the very back. Hidden inside the back cover was an envelope Emily had never noticed before. Her name was written neatly across the front. She frowned. I've never seen this. Thomas smiled. It was always there. You just weren't ready for it. Emily carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The moment she recognized Margaret's graceful handwriting, her chest tightened. It began simply, Dear Caretaker, if you're reading this, then Thomas has finally accepted that he cannot watch over this house forever. Emily looked at Thomas. He nodded quietly. She continued reading. This house has never belonged to the person whose name appears on a deed. It belongs to every soul who has ever found hope within these walls. But every light needs someone willing to keep it burning. Emily's hands trembled. Thomas and I promised each other many years ago that when the right person arrived, this house would become theirs. Not as a reward, as a responsibility. Emily slowly lowered the letter. She looked at Thomas in disbelief. He smiled. The house belongs to you now. She shook her head immediately. I can't. I don't know how. I'm not Margaret. Thomas laughed softly. Exactly. Emily looked confused. This house doesn't need another Margaret. He smiled warmly. It needs an Emily. The word settled deep inside her heart. All her life, she had believed she needed to become someone else before she could deserve love. Someone stronger, smarter, more successful, less broken. But Margaret had never been searching for perfection. She had been searching for compassion, and compassion belonged naturally to someone who remembered what loneliness felt like. Thomas pointed gently toward the letter. There's one more part. Emily continued reading. You may spend years believing you are unqualified. Most caretakers do. The world teaches us that only extraordinary people change lives. But the world often misunderstands miracles. Lives are changed every day by ordinary people who make one extraordinary decision. They choose to stay. Emily pressed the letter against her heart. The room had grown completely silent. Without her noticing, the guests had gathered quietly in the doorway. The young woman who had first arrived during the rain stepped forward. You stayed for me. The widower smiled. You reminded me that life wasn't over. The grandmother squeezed Emily's hand. You gave my grandson a place where he could laugh again. One after another. Voices filled the room. You listened. You believed me. You made me feel seen. You reminded me I still mattered. Emily covered her face as tears streamed through her fingers. For so many years, she had measured her worth by everyone who had walked away from her. Now she realized there was another way to measure a life. By how many people found hope because you chose not to walk away from them. Thomas slowly stood. From his coat pocket, he removed the old brass key that had opened the front door for decades. He placed it gently into Emily's hand. Its weight surprised her, not because of the metal, because of everything it represented. The light is yours now. She closed her fingers around the key. I'll take care of it. Thomas smiled. I know. Thomas passed away peacefully 6 weeks later. He was sitting in Margaret's rocking chair beside the fireplace. The fire crackled softly as snow began falling outside. His final words to Emily were almost a whisper. Leave the light on. She promised she would, and she kept that promise. The years passed quietly. Neighbors began referring to the old stone house simply as Margaret's light. People donated blankets. Local farmers brought fresh vegetables. Doctors volunteered their time. Former guests returned, not because they needed help anymore, but because they wanted to become part of someone else's healing. Some repaired broken windows. Some cooked meals. Some simply sat beside frightened strangers who weren't ready to speak. The house never became famous. It didn't need to. It became something far more important. A place where forgotten people remembered they still belonged. Nearly 20 years after Emily first walked through the front door, another winter storm swept across the valley. Emily was 47 now. A few silver strands framed her face. She sat near the fireplace listening to one of Margaret's old cassette tapes when she heard 3 gentle knocks at the front door. She smiled before standing. When she opened the door, a young woman stood outside, trembling beneath the falling snow. A worn backpack rested on one shoulder. Her coat was too thin for the weather. Fear filled her tired eyes. I'm sorry, the young woman whispered. I saw the light. For just a moment. Emily wasn't looking at a stranger. She was looking at the frightened 27-year-old woman she had once been. Cold. Alone. Certain that nobody in the world was waiting for her. Emily stepped aside. Warm light spilled across the snowy porch. She smiled gently. "Come in." Then, with tears shining in her eyes, she spoke the words that completed a story begun decades earlier. "I've been expecting you at that moment." Emily finally understood the greatest lesson Margaret had tried to teach all along. The miracle had never been finding a house with its light still burning. The miracle was living long enough to become the person who left that light on for someone else. Some stories stay with us because of the twists. Others stay because they quietly remind us of something we've forgotten about ourselves. Emily's story was never really about an old stone house hidden in the woods. It was about a truth that many people spend their entire lives searching for. No one is beyond hope. No one is too broken to begin again. And sometimes, the people who believe they have the least to offer become the ones who change the most lives. For years, Emily believed her greatest weakness was that she had been abandoned. She thought her painful past made her unworthy of love. But in the end, that very pain became the reason she could recognize loneliness in someone else's eyes before they ever spoke a word. Her scars did not disqualify her. They prepared her. Margaret understood something the world often forgets. People don't always need someone to solve their problems. They need someone willing to sit beside them while they gather the strength to solve them themselves. A warm meal may quiet an empty stomach. A safe bed may ease a difficult night. But being seen, being welcomed, being reminded that your life still matters, those gifts can change the direction of an entire future. Perhaps that is why kindness is never as small as it seems. We rarely witness the full journey of the people we help. A single conversation may prevent someone from giving up. One act of compassion may inspire another. A door held open today may become a shelter for countless others tomorrow. Emily never became famous. She never sought recognition. She simply chose, day after day, to leave the light on. And because of that simple decision, generations of strangers discovered that even after the darkest winters, warmth still existed somewhere in the world. Perhaps there is someone in your own life who feels invisible. A neighbor living alone. A coworker who smiles but never talks about what they're carrying. A family member who quietly stopped asking for help because they no longer believe anyone will come. You may not be able to erase their pain. Very few of us can, but you can remind them that they do not have to face it alone. Sometimes that begins with a phone call, a visit, a shared meal, a listening ear, or simply saying, "I'm here." Those two words have rescued more hearts than we will ever know. As Margaret discovered, as Thomas believed, and as Emily eventually became, the brightest light in this world is rarely the one that shines for itself. It is the one that stays lit. So someone lost in the darkness can find their way home.